Right, we have now started looking at devising our own Frantic Assembly piece. We looked at what we'd done in the workshop, looked at some of the things we'd learned, and we focused on some of the things that we actually did during the workshop to recreate. So first of all, we separated into groups. This was sort of random, but because we're doing the Frantic Assembly piece within the whole class, we separated into smaller groups and taught each other some of the key pieces that we thought stood out when we did the workshop, some of the key pieces that we thought would be effective, and then we thought about how they might relate later on. We had a good discussion in the lesson after about how they might relate. And then we had a discussion about how we might begin the piece with opening, which we were going to do the lesson after. So initially we looked at 3 really strong pieces that we watched from the workshop, and they all brought in different aspects that we liked, different techniques and things that we'd learned on the workshop. We attempted to learnt to copy Jade and Marlon's line duet, where they had to draw lines across each other and they had a lift in there, and it was done in 2s, so we had me, Hannah, Marlon and Bella do that. We had the Bruce and Maya's line duet also, but theirs had an aspect where they were on the floor, so they were playing about with different levels, different areas, different dimensions, and they had 3 sets of 2 in there, and then the other 3, which was Hannah, Leah and Peter, were teaching Peter their nerve pulling piece, which consisted of different types of levels, using the nerves in a different way. It was a different sort of movement to the others, so not big lifts, but more to do with the abstract movement, and it was quicker and it was a contrast. We were also, when we looked at them individually, we first looked at them individually and then we thought about adding lifts in between. We adapted our pieces so that they matched the amount of people we had, because we learned about Frantic Assembly. Often they would use the amount of people they had to their advantage, so use the best out of how many people they had to do different lifts, to do different things that they could do. So not only did we look at duets that were translated into maybe with 4 people, the duets themselves still stood, but we'd create lifts, we'd create shifts where we'd swap partners, taken from inspiration of Flirty Tango that we did in Frantic Assembly. And we changed about with music and adding new lifts and adding some transitions. So as looking at the other groups after we did this, obviously I can talk a little bit about what I think went well with their groups, but first I want to talk more into depth about my group and what I thought we did and why we adapted it like this and why I think it went quite well. Still some things that we could improve, obviously. When copying the piece, we initially just wanted to learn it. Once we'd learnt it, it was me and Hannah and Marlon and Bella, and they were working together. We did the opposite lifts, and we tried to get it in synchrony. I think because of the style that we were going for, we chose to use the same music that the man had demonstrated in Frantic Assembly Workshop. It created like this old wartimey sort of feel, so it felt like almost a romantic ballroom dance, we got the impression. And obviously because we'd already seen it, it wasn't like we'd thought about the feelings before we thought about the movement. We had time to evaluate the movement and then give a feeling towards it that came sort of naturally, which I felt like is what you do when you're looking at Frantic Assembly. So we'd thought more into detail about that. And I think this was effective when doing it in synchrony, trying to get the movements synchronized. Obviously this is quite difficult because when you're trying to do movements to get them done at the same time isn't easy, but when we could achieve this, I feel like it would give a nice effect of repetition of movement, showing how in a romantic dance it's well choreographed, almost that relationships were choreographed in the olden days, how they were all set out, how there were standards that you had to meet, how there were traditional roles, and sort of a hint to those kind of ideas. I thought the way we adapted it was obviously to do that in synchrony. We had facing each other. We weren't sure where we were going to position the audience, but we found that often with the pieces we rotated anyway, so we'd end up facing different kinds of directions, so it didn't matter entirely where we would position an audience, but when we turned each other facing different ways. At first we just kept it so that we were doing it in synchrony, and then we decided that it would be a possibility to switch partners. So me and Bella switch, so that Bella is with Hannah and I am with Marlon for another turn. We drew the lines on the other partners and did the duet with the other partners, and I don't know whether this was like a hint to like promiscuity. It gave that sort of effect potentially, and I think definitely started to show off this idea of relationship and contradicting relationship and old relationships, and how it sort of felt dance-like, how that movement itself could have connotations towards like a romantic relationship or different feelings depending on where you looked, depending on what your focus was. So we thought a lot about our focus in this as well. So we experimented with looking at a partner, looking at our original partner, looking up or down, and I think that we thought about we stuck with more the idea of looking at our original partner, the idea of loyalty and promiscuity contradicting it themselves. But obviously that was just an afterthought after we'd figured out the movement, and this would be something that we could experiment with and delve further into. When doing more of the movement and adding the lift in, we thought about how we might transition, and we thought about how we might end. We weren't 100% sure on how we might end our little piece, so we just finished or sort of facing inwards and looking at each other. But I think that we thought maybe potentially about the idea of switching out more partners, potentially adding a lift. But if we were going to create a bigger piece anyway, we might want to utilise more people into a bigger lift that would have more of a meaning behind it, rather than just adding a lift for no reason. So I think that it's not really like a major thing we should be thinking about, but the way that we might transition in and out of it might be an interesting thing to explore. But yeah, we also looked at the whole ideas altogether of potentially when evaluating the other groups, of how the main message might be shown, and more about the main message, especially in contrast to like what we had initially thought when we're looking at Frantic Assembly. So looking at the other people's work, it was a lot, because Frantic Assembly is so close, so intimate, like in the feelings, and you have to be quite close to the people around you. It's hard not to sort of have this sense of like class structure and relationships and, you know, closeness and gestures. So I think a lot of what we had done we saw as a sort of relationship platform. Different eras were said, that different pieces seemed to come from different eras, and we had a lot of sense of like sort of relationships through the ages, relationships through the years, how roles have changed, and what a relationship consists of. A lot of love, conflict, and a lot of promiscuity, like cheating on each other, was like a common thing that sort of suggested when looking at each other's, that other groups might not have realised, but that we had pointed out and we thought about. So when looking at that, we thought a lot about relationships in that sense, or when evaluating what we'd looked at. I had some notes on my phone. So the things were like change, loss of identity. We'd obviously thought about some of the feelings that common feelings that Frantic Assembly pieces gave us when we did the workshop. So I think I mentioned feeling lost, power, and some other things, but those came up, but we felt like that relationships was a stronger thing that linked to all our pieces and made it unique. So I think that we're going to look into that idea more, especially when it comes to transitions, bigger group lifts, and potentially how we might start and finish the piece. So now we're going to look at how we're going to start the piece in next lesson. We've already got some sort of brainstorms going on, and how this will link to our big message.